Right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to What's in the King's Speech. Over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the key crime and justice elements of last week's King's Speech. And I've got a great panel here to have that discussion. We've got Baroness Claire Fox, we have Professor Jen Hendry, we have Dr. Rory Kelly, and we have Rob Allen. I'm pretty sure we're not going to be short of things to say. We're going to be looking at the two main crime and justice bills that were in the King's Speech, the Crime and Policing Bill and the Victims' Courts and Public Protection Bill. And we're also going to be taking a quick look at the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, a rather dull sounding bill with quite significant implications, not least of all for the government's plans to build more prisons. We also want to kind of talk towards the end about what might be missing from the King's speech and what we should expect next. But first, let's just turn to the King's speech itself and the state opening of Parliament. There's a huge amount of ceremonial and tradition behind it. We've got horse-drawn carriages. There's Black Rod banging on the door. There's an MP who has to be held hostage at Buckingham Palace. It all kind of feels like, for a supposedly modern democracy, I never quite know whether it's a great tradition that we are upholding or just rather a lot at this stage of sort of medieval pseudo cosplay. So, Claire, do you want to kind of kick us off on that? What are all these traditions about?
Well, there is a cosplay element to it, and I, I can understand why people react against it, but there are some symbolic things that are important in both a negative and a positive way. I've always thought that it's rather peculiar for a democracy that the opening of Parliament happens in the unelected House of Lords with a monarch who ceremoniously sits, and the most prominent thing in the House of Lords as a chamber is the gold throne. And it's only used once a year, but it's to open Parliament. But it does feel peculiar that the Prime Minister gets the monarch to read to an unelected House the laws of the land. I mean, that's peculiar. And then this sort of weird thing happens because everybody's on the estate opening. The lords who choose to go there, which by the way I didn't, wear the ermine, so it's very kind of grandiose. And the king then sends his representative to, which is Black Rod, the user of Black Rod, to summon the members of the House of Commons. So he kind of calls over the plebs, basically the commoners, to come over. But important is the king can't go into the Commons himself because the last time King went into the Commons, he had his head cut off, right? So he ended up. So in a way, is a kind of an example of the modern. Anyway, he calls the elected parliamentarians over, and then he reads the King's speech out. So it's tradition and symbolism. But I think there's just one thing that really reminds me that why symbolism sometimes works. It is the foundation of modern democracy because the doorkeepers initially slammed the door in the face of Black Rod at the Commons, which symbolises the independence of the House of Commons from monarchy. And it does actually emphasise the monarch's ceremonial role and not that he's got any real role. So I'm not one for saying, oh, we'd have a better democracy if we were in some kind of modern technocratic building. I quite like the ceremony. I just feel sometimes a little uneasy that everything starts in the Lords, which is anti-democratic. And actually, I would be for abolishing the House of Lords, even though I'm in it. There you go.
And I suppose if the king, so I mean, leaving aside the question about the monarchy per se, if the king turned up, in a kind of I don't know, a sort of Rolls Royce or indeed a Tesla rather than a horse-drawn carriage, it would kind of maybe be so certainly lacking in some of the ceremonial, I suppose. So there's maybe
Well,
more.
well, there's also, some of the people who are most opposed to the pomp and ceremony when they turn up in their Teslas are just kind of modern day aristocrats. There's different forms of aristocracy. Let me tell you, people who run society might be very cool and might drive the right cars, but they're the people with the real power. So I'm much more worried about them than people wearing crowns in this instance.
And there's a sort of tradition of an MP having to stay at the Buckingham Palace. I mean, formally, I think they're meant to be a hostage.
Yes.
What's
Right.
that about?
I don't ask me because I don't know.
Right. Anyone else know?
I was going to check on Wikipedia, and then I thought that was cheating. So there are
Yeah.
all sorts of things they do. They search to make sure that this is like once a week. They search in the House of Lords to make sure that nobody's got gunpowder based on the gunpowder plot.
Right.
So I'm afraid I don't understand the hostage taking. I confess.
I have to say I was, as I always like to be a know-it-all, so I did look it up, and I think, but I didn't know before I looked it up, and I think it's something to do with a surety for the sovereign safety that, we're going to take one of yours. So
Right.
if you do chop his head off, then we'll chop their head off, I guess. Well, there you go. Somebody has just put in the chat. Tradition ritual has its place. Given what we have, I'm more concerned by far about what is said as per the investiture of Shabana Mahmood and UMP Solicitor General Sarah Sackman, rather than all the kind of the sort of the ceremonial.
Richard,
Yes.
if I just may, from a slightly external perspective, there seems a certain irony to the pomp and tradition at a time when it looks like hereditary peers are on their way out. We value this tradition, but also we need reform of the Lords.
Well,
Although, if I could just very quickly on that, I think that there's a bit of too much fuss made about kicking the hereditary peers out, as though all of the other peers are there more legitimately. I mean, everybody in the House of Lords has been appointed in an anti-democratic fashion, and I say that as somebody who's in there. So I can't help but feel a sort of self-regard from appointed peers put in for political reasons, looking down their nose on hereditary peers as though somehow they're not legitimate. So sometimes the anti-tradition mob, the modernizers, that's what I'm saying, need to kind of catch themselves on potentially and look to themselves.
Thank you, Claire. Let's just move on to the King's speech itself. I mean, I was really struck one of the opening lines of the King's speech. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness, and opportunity for all. I mean, I think the one thing that I take from that is whatever else the King's speech is, certainly wasn't written by the King, but it always makes me smile when I see a monarch speech and what the government of the day kind of seeks to ventriloquize the monarch of the day is having to say. So, Rob, I mean, who writes the King's speech, and what's it really there to do?
Well, I mean, just on the ceremonial part, which reflected in a way. I mean, whether we like it or not, the monarch, the Lords, and the Commons are the constituent parts of a Parliament in our constitution, like it or not. And it's one of the few times once a year-ish that everybody gets together and there is this ceremony. Obviously, the monarch's speech is written for them by the government of the day, in this case, a new government, so it's particularly important and significant. The speech itself is very short and pretty broad in terms of the kinds of things you've just mentioned, what the government aims to do. The interesting bit from my point of view is the briefing, the detailed briefing that the government of the day issue later that day, setting out the bills that will be put before Parliament during the course of this first Parliament of the Labour government. And we wait to see in what order they will come and how they progress. Remember, it's only November last year. We had the last state opening of Parliament, the last one of the Conservative government. Obviously, it was a much foreshortened Parliament. I mean, 2 out of the 3 criminal justice bills that were mentioned in that King's speech didn't make it across the line. And finally, all King's monarch speeches, I think, at the end say other measures will be laid before the Houses, which is a kind of saying this isn't it, Lords, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we think we want to do now, but there'll be plenty more to come.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that there are a lot of bills. It's about 40 bills, I think, and one assumes that not all of them are going to make their way through Parliament. So the actual order of the bills will be, I think, a sign early on about the priority that government is giving to them. But as you say, there may be other stuff coming down the chute during the course of this parliamentary term. All right, let's move on to the first of those criminal justice bills then, which is the Crime and Policing Bill. It was described in the King's Speech in the following terms: legislation will be brought forward to strengthen community policing, give the police greater powers to deal with antisocial behaviour. And, you know, that's a very brief summary of quite a detailed bill. When we looked this morning, it didn't seem to have been published yet, but I'm sure it will be published in the not too distant future. But there's a range of measures. There's stuff about neighbourhood policing. There's a kind of interesting, at least to the policing nerds, about suggesting that the police inspectorate might be effectively given forms of regulatory functions rather than inspectorate functions, being able to intervene in so-called failing police forces. There's something about civil orders, new respect orders, which sounds rather like the old antisocial behaviour orders. And I know both Jen and Rory will almost certainly have something to say about that. There's some specific offences around assaulting shop workers, and also provisions to scrap what was only introduced a few years ago, the scrapping of making some shoplifting of goods under £200 a summary of only offence, which effectively means it can be dealt with more quickly. So the government is saying they want to scrap that. There's a ban on so-called ninja swords, and sanctions for company executives to sell such things online. And there's new laws on the criminal exploitation of children and creation of local arrangements for young futures prevention partnerships. So there's loads there. Let's see what happens when it actually comes to be debated in Parliament. But let's go back then. Let's have a look at neighbourhood policing. And Rob, I don't know if you'd like to start us off on this. So neighbourhood policing feels very new Labour. You know, more police on the beat. Is that really going to be about tackling crime, or is it maybe about something slightly more nebulous to do with police legitimacy, public confidence, police being seen to be there doing things, even if they're not necessarily, doing the kinds of thing the public feels they would want them to do?
Well, I think the government will hope it'll do both those things. What do we mean by neighbourhood policing? I suppose a more visible presence of police out and about, more contact with the public, more partnership with community organisations on a local neighbourhood basis. Reasonable evidence, quite good evidence that hotspot policing, so-called putting police resources into areas which have more than their fair share of crime, does seem to have an impact on safety. There were some encouraging stats from Merseyside that came out last week about their initiative on that. I think there's a slight tension between a guarantee that everybody will get neighbourhood policing, whether or not their neighbourhood is particularly high crime or even medium crime or low crime. I mean, hotspot policing suggests you put more resources into the areas where there is a lot of crime. If you ask people, everybody will say they want more police on the beat, whether or not their neighbourhood is particularly high crime. So I think how police services are able to afford and prioritise and ration their resources in a way that meets this so-called guarantee will be, a problem for chief constables and operational officers down the line.
And if the police side, it's a really good point about the tensions there with policing strategies. The implication from the bill is that the police inspectorate might have a greater role in kind of, in a sense, marking the police. Well, she's more than marking the police's homework. They mark the police homework at the moment, but they'd effectively also, be in principle kind of initiating sanctions against police who don't kind of, meet the grade, or potentially in other ways seeking to kind of influence their operations. What's your thoughts, Rob, on that?
Well, I'm not a huge expert on the governance of policing, but I know I think there are 4 police forces in so-called special measures at the moment, including the Met. There were 6 in special measures in 2022. What does special measures mean? It means that they are subject to increased scrutiny. They have to produce an improvement action plan. They get additional support from the College of Policing and the National Police Chiefs Council. I mean, that sounds pretty much like intervening to me already. So I'm not quite sure what sort of step change is going to be taken. The only other point I'd make on policing is this is central government wanting to legislate about policing and guarantee that every police force does this, that, and the other. The last Conservative government in coalition introduced the Police and Crime Commissioners, which the idea of which was really to give a stronger voice to local prioritisation and decision-making about what the police should do. So how, during the course of this government, that relationship between the Home Secretary ultimately and Police and Crime Commissioner pans out in terms of deciding where police officers should be deployed, I think it'll be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, because it does kind of seem like there's potentially quite a lot of overlapping structures all now focusing in on the police. I mean, we the Police and Crime Commission, as you mentioned, Labour in previous elections said they wanted to scrap them. They're certainly not planning to scrap them now. As you say, we've got various kinds of policing agencies about sort of improved professionalisation and all the rest, and now the inspectorate being given new powers. So it does kind of feel like it's a bit of a mismatch at the moment. Yeah. All right, look, before we move on, we're going to have a couple of polls during this programme. And the first of them, which we're going to put on now, is about neighbourhood policing. And it's a fairly simple question, really. Do we need basically more police on patrol? So here's your opportunity. If you want to kind of vote on that, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll come back to that towards the end of this segment and see what the audience think of it. All right, let's move on to another area in this current bill, respect orders, which does kind of feel a bit like a reboot of the ASBO. Jen, what do you kind of make? We've got a lot of civil orders.
Feels like a reboot of the ASBO because it effectively is a reboot of the ASBO. I mean, and until we see the actual specifics, it's hard to judge. But what has been discussed up to now is effectively sort of, if it looks like an ASBO and sounds like an ASBO, then this is broadly what we're getting. So what I'm particularly interested in is this sort of in-between rhetoric that you see. So first of all, you mentioned in the preamble, one of the leading phrases is security. And you see the King's Speech sort of permeated with this emphasis on security. So antisocial behaviour is obviously one of those strands. And the interesting thing about ASB in terms of the ASBO is that 20 years on, more than 20 years on now, there is no evidence base that anything ASBO-esque actually worked. Like, we don't actually have any proof, any real evidence as to the efficiency or effectiveness of this type of provision. But I think more importantly, the phrasing in the King's Speech and about respect orders more generally has been as a civil order, or alternatively this weird phrasing of an intensified civil order. And I'm not entirely sure what an intensified civil order is supposed to mean, other than this hybrid form. And I expect Rory will want to come in on that hybrid form point, because this blending of the civil order with these criminal sanctions, or these criminal escalations on breach, seem to be the definition of this intensification that is being spoken of. And in that sense, we are looking at just another behavioural control order, just another ASBO type form. And honestly, we have so many orders of this ilk right now, so many of this stripe, without, again, an evidence base for their effectiveness, that it seems generally unwise to introduce something like this straight out the gate.
And Rory, I could see you sort of smiling and nodding as Jen was speaking. Would you sort of agree with that kind of diagnosis?
I think there's always space to tinker with these behavioural orders or hybrid orders. So the most positive case that could be made for a new order is, do we need wider powers of arrest than we have under the present injunction model for antisocial behaviour? Do we need breach to go back to being a criminal offence without any tangible effects in practice? But I think Jan's right. The bigger problem is that there are now so many of these orders down, and they keep going to the Court of Appeal, and have recently been to the Supreme Court being challenged, that maybe what we need is just to step back and to say, let's have a substantial review, like Justice have done, say a government-led or department-led one, saying, why do we have 30 different behavioural orders? What do they do? And key, do they work?
And I suppose with this legislation, I mean, depending on how it's set up, that might be an opportunity for Parliament to rationalise, because you can obviously introduce a new respect order, but you can also, take out of circulation, as it were, some of, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but at least there is the sort of principle. Claire, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the name of the order is significant, but tellingly technocratic way of dealing with the bigger problem, which is to say that you're going to get respect by introducing a respect order is, kind of insultingly simplistic. But it indicates, I think, I mean, we should put into context, maybe what happened in terms of Hare Hills in Leeds the other day and the riot. And the idea that if you were threatened with a respect order that you wouldn't riot just is laughable, it seems to me. And in all of these instances, I mean, just to quote from the Prime Minister's introduction to the longer extended notes on the King's Speech, he says, "We will take back our streets, giving police new powers to crack down on antisocial behaviour." But they've got the powers. But in the instance of Hare Hills, the police, I mean, to put it in a populist fashion, ran away, or they didn't, or they were driven out, or something happened. And there is, I think, a popular perception that the policing of this country is not going well. And it seems that and that people feel as though the police aren't taking them seriously. But then they bring in what are, I mean, Rory and Jen have described well, these orders, endless orders, but actually with quite punitive outcomes if you get done under them, by the way, because you can be sent to jail under them, but they're not for specific crimes. I mean, what? You could get a respect order for showing a lack of respect. I mean, antisocial behaviour, equally vague, and ASBO's were a disaster, as Jen explained. So I'm very nervous about
an important one about the breadth of the term antisocial behaviour. We see the same problem with the term serious disruption, with another hybrid order, another behavioural control order. And there's a vagueness around what is actually being covered. And one of the things, again, in the extended notes on the King's Speech is the power, the police power to ban persistent offenders. And it's like, well, if it's a civil order, we're not really talking about offenders, we're talking about people who are behaving broadly antisocially. And there is this, perhaps, I think, perceived lack of a mechanism for police to do something about persistent, low-level antisocial behaviour. That's very different from offenders when we're talking about criminality. And for that, you have the CBO, that's attendant problems also. So there does seem to be I think this is a crowded ecosystem where a new order, as Rory says, is almost certainly not what's required, when we could be looking at a more bottom-up, grassroots sort of investment in youth services, public services generally, support for people experiencing homelessness, and I think greater mental health services and support that would probably deal more effectively, certainly at the coalface, in terms of these more entrenched antisocial behaviour issues that are manifesting as such, as opposed to social problems.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just quickly say, I mean, to be fair, as far as young people are concerned, there are some plans, or were in the manifesto, to introduce an approach, a kind of multi-agency approach, these youth hubs. I mean, I've no idea what a hub will be in practice, but something called a Young Futures Initiative. The idea of trying to bring more mental health help to young people at risk and so on. I think one of the problems with, in a sense, focusing on Parliament and King's Speech, that's where laws are made, but the answers to these issues don't lie in more laws, as colleagues have said. It's about actually having infrastructure and people and well-trained staff to be able to help people find a pathway out of antisocial behaviour, to understand it, to provide some therapeutic help if needed. So, and I think, hopefully there will be some of that. I mean, as for the respect, I mean, is a very conscious nod back to New Labour, isn't it? If you remember, Tony Blair had this respect agenda, which was the kind of way, the kind of envelope in which a whole lot of measures were introduced. So I think they will have these orders, I'm sure. I hope that they're not used terribly much, and the way in which what is a serious problem is tackled is through on the ground initiatives of the kind I've mentioned.
Thank you. Well, look, let's have a look at this poll that we put up earlier. So if we want to kind of share the results, here we go. Can we see that? 54% say yes, we do need more police on patrol, and 27 no. It's a bit of a kind of surprise to me. I mean, these are always kind of slightly self-selecting polls, obviously, but I wonder whether this is maybe illustrative of the point, Claire, that you were making, that actually there is just a sense that things are not going right with the police at the moment, and perhaps we just need more of them. I mean, that would be kind of one very obvious reading of that poll.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if you're addressing. I mean, the problem for me is not. It's fairly obvious that when you have endless stories of there's no point reporting your bike getting nicked or your house being burgled, and when you have situations where I mean we will have all experienced it personally, I would have thought, which is that you feel as though a crime is being committed against me, but there's no point going to the police. Or when you go to the police, they kind of want to give you a criminal number for your insurance. The worst thing is that when they start phoning you up and saying, do you need counselling? You think, no, I just want you to get the person who did the crime. Leave me alone. I mean, there's all sorts of, there's that. But so more of the police doing the wrong kind of policing, it would be wrong. But you can understand why people feel that you want more, because there seems to be an absence of the police. But it kind of relates back to that order discussion that we had. On the night of the now not celebratory and not Euros final, right? The police issued an antisocial behaviour dispersal order so that nobody could drink out anywhere in Westminster, because they were, there's kind of always this like football fans or the yobbos, right? And regardless of where you stand politically on this, every weekend practically for a long time since October the 7th, there's been huge demonstrations which the police have said, we haven't got the powers to disperse them. But, people going out and potentially celebrating or drowning their sorrows, depending on which way you look at it, the football, were treated as though they were criminals. So what I'm trying to say is I can understand that people just feel abandoned by the police, and that the wrong kind of two-tier policing occurs too consistently. So I don't want more police, but I do want efficient policing if we're going to have police force.
Richard, if I can just hop in on that.
Sure, go on,
just to say that, I mean, I think the poll could probably be looking at two different considerations, and there'll be a lot of people who are keen to have more bobbies on the beat, as it were, from that pure securitized perspective. And there'll be other people who are not reassured by the presence of police on the streets of their community and don't see it as reassuring and don't see it as something that is there for their benefit. And I think that there's two very clear, distinctive threads in this discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, and thank you, Claire. Let's just move on to one quick final element of this first bill that we're discussing, which is about shoplifting, because it relates to another issue about, in a funny sort of way, about policing and certainly about sentencing in the court. So back in 2014, the then coalition government basically changed the law, which meant that small value shoplifting, these are goods under £200, would be treated through an expedited process, basically as a summary offence, which for many small shopkeepers is kind of quite infuriating. But it was an attempt to recognise that if you had the courts all clogged up with just lots of real petty offending, then it was difficult for them to focus on the big stuff. And Labour appear to want to return back to a situation where even small shoplifting items are treated, potentially as a tribal either way. So potentially ultimately going, I guess, to to a jury trial. But I may have got the wrong end of the stick on that. I don't know, Rory, do you kind of have any sense of what's being proposed here and whether it's a kind of a good or a bad idea?
My instinct prior to seeing any legislation is that, yes, this would be removing the carve out for goods stolen from a shop under £200 and would be returning to theft in general being either way. And this is said to make theft laws in practice enforceable. But there's a real oddity to that. What is the significant gain here? Or do we expect to see more cases brought if we've got Crown Court powers? Is that not just going to lead to more delays for shoplifting and, in fact, more generally, in an already overcrowded criminal justice system? It's hardly going to lead to more significant sentences as well, because the magistrates could already had reasonable sentencing powers. Are the Crown Court really going to start handing out 2-3 years in prison for stealing a pair of jeans?
It is a kind of an interesting one. It'll be very interesting to see how both the Commons and the Lords kind of engage with this particular provision, because at a time when the courts are trying desperately to clear the backlog in the courts, on the face of it, it seems two things are going to happen. You're either going to have lots of petty offending coming into the court system in a way that maybe could have been dealt with more efficiently, or the police are going to be going back to forms of cautioning and informal resolution of this kind of stuff. So it's going to be, I don't know, Claire, whether you have any thoughts as a parliamentarian of how this might kind of fall in the debate, or is that just crystal ball gazing?
It is a little. But the thing is, they've also want to reintroduce this new, a specific offence of attacking a shop, of somebody who works in a shop. You think it wasn't against the law to attack someone who worked in a shop? Why do you need a specific offence? So I don't quite know whether that's because some of the complaints and grumbles about people feeling insecure is this notion that things are getting nicked out your local shop all the time and that nobody's doing anything, and that it feels unfair. I mean, I can't help think that, that there might be an increase in the number of small shopkeepers being attacked when they bring in their daft tobacco bill, where people are going to be having to check, whether how old somebody is later on. Anyway, I'm making a joke, but a lot of these things just feel unnecessary. But I understand that they're trying to do crime as PR, and that's never a good thing.
I mean, I wonder how much of this, you were talking about the legislative priorities, I wonder how much of this is performative. If there's a sense of, we'll make a splash and there can be references to protection of shopkeepers and references to shoplifting, and this is actually, when we see it come into fruition, if it does, quite far down the legislative agenda in terms of priorities. So there may be a performativity.
I'm not sure. I mean, there's been a lot of lobbying by the retail associations on the last government, particularly on this issue of the assaulting a shop worker. And I did notice that one of the people that signed one of the letters demanding it was James Timpson, who's now in the government as a Minister of Prisons. So he's going to reap what he sows in terms of if there are more people sentenced to short prison sentences for assaulting shop workers or indeed shoplifting. He's going to be responsible for accommodating.
Thank you, Rob. Right, let's move on to the second of the criminal justice bills, the Victims' Courts and Public Protection Bill. So this is how the King's Speech put it. Legislation we brought forward to strengthen support for victims. That's it. That's all it says. So I think it's fair to say that those words are doing some fairly heavy lifting. Amongst the provisions of the bill are strengthening the powers of the Victims' Commissioner, forcing those found guilty in court to attend their sentencing hearing, which was partly it wasn't a Labour manifesto pledge, but it was something that the previous Conservative government had been pushing quite hard. Restricting parental access for those convicted of child sex offences and making it more difficult for those individuals to change their names. Expanding the use of associate prosecutors in courts, which kind of sounds like quite a technical change, but potentially quite significant. And specialist courts for fast-track rape cases. So let's just kind of get stuck in here, and let's start with this notion of forcing those found guilty to attend their sentencing hearings. Now, there are a number of kind of quite high-profile cases recently where those convicted did not attend their sentencing hearings, including Lucy Letby, Jordan McSweeney, who's convicted of murdering Zara Lima, and Thomas Cashman, who's convicted of murdering 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell. So it's one of those things which I suspect is potentially going to be quite popular. But Rory, is it going to kind of, I mean, is it a good idea? I mean, does not a sort of someone who's convicted have a right not to turn up to the sentencing hearing if they want? Or, I mean, what's your thoughts about it?
I understand the instinctive appeal of this proposal and why it can be so appealing across the political spectrum. Sentencing is about sanctioning and blaming an individual for a wrongdoing. They, in theory, should be there for that. But in practice, if they say, I'm not going to go, how do we go about ensuring sentencing can fulfill its purposes and making them attend? So we've got a couple of ideas here, but they both run into quite significant problems. We could sentence them some more, give them, say, up to 2 more years in prison. But if someone's already got life imprisonment, is that really going to affect their decision-making? So we turn to our other possibility. We could use reasonable force and physically force people to sit in a dock and be sentenced. Where we run into the obvious difficulty, if you force someone to be there, what if they start disrupting the proceedings? What if they start hurling abuse at victims and victims' families and start talking across the judge? And then what's going to happen? The judge is going to issue, find them in contempt, and they've got 2 more years on a whole life order or life imprisonment with 30 years. This is one of those things that in theory sounds really good, but in practice has significant difficulties unless we're going to go to quite draconian steps of gagging and binding people to bring them for sentencing, which of course we're not going to do.
What's the situation at the moment if a defendant is in a sentencing hearing and has chosen to be there, and then in the middle of the sentencing hearing starts picking up a fuss or doing what you were saying, hurling abuse at the victim's family? I mean, I guess they can be removed from court, but the judge wouldn't kind of say, well, I was originally going to give you 3 years, but because of the way you behaved, I'm going to give you 4 years now. I imagine that doesn't happen, or in theory, could the judge do that?
I'm probably not meant to say it, given my profession, but it all seems a bit academic to me when someone has got such a substantial sentence of life imprisonment, because this is the context of this political reform. You're right, Letby, McSweeney, Cashman, these people all got life imprisonment. So the fact that the judge may find them in contempt and give them another year in prison or less, the fact that they may get a new power, specifically here, to make them attend, backed by 2 years in prison, what difference does it make in practice?
In the chat so far, the kinds of comments so far on this issue are one saying this is a case of encouraging victims to bay for blood, another one suggesting it's just immoral and it's about vengeance rather than justice. Does anyone any of the panel here want to make the argument for this? Claire, you look like you were going to maybe say something, but I don't want to if you don't really want to make that argument.
I don't want to make the case for it at all. I wanted to say slightly more broadly that one of the problems with victim-centred justice and giving more powers to the Victims Commissioner, I mean, I've just sat through very many hours of my life during the Victims and Prisoners Bill. And the vast majority of that was about victims. And by the way, I participated in some of it. I'm not being glib, but the point about the justice system is that it removes justice from the victims so that you don't have overly subjective decision making. It's a state, the state says retribution will not be subjective. We will act on behalf of, and we all know, of course, that if your kid is run over by a car, you will want to string up the person who's driving the car. I mean, that's what you would want to do instinctively. And the court system takes it out of your hands to make that decision. So I think that the reason I feel queasy about this forcing them to hear is because it's sort of driven by this notion that the victims need closure, and they'll only get closure if they can watch the person being sentenced suffer. And I agree with Rory. I'd want that too if I was the victim's family or the victim or what have you. But that doesn't mean that we should be very wary of this. It's just the wrong instinct for me. So, you know, there'll be some good things in the victims, you know, in the list of what they're going to do for victims. But a lot of the victims' work, I think, is ill thought out, because you dare not argue against anything that says you're pro-victim in the House of Lords, let me tell you, because they treat you like you're some kind of monster. And I think that's the danger with posing everything as pro-victim, as though therefore anyone who says anything that goes against it, you know, doesn't care about the feelings of the victims.
Sticking with the pro-victim, or at least potential victims, one of the other provisions here about limiting parental access for those convicted of child sex offences. And I suppose probably a number of people who think, well, aren't they already? So be interested, Claire, in your thoughts there as well. I mean, Harriet Harman, the former Labour MP, described parental rights for convicted child sex offenders as, quote, part of the hangover of the patriarchy. I mean, would you agree with that kind of assessment?
Well, you know, that at the moment the access is very, very limited. If it's very, very limited. It's not as though you're kind of like, no, you can have the kids for the next 2 weeks, right? I mean, you know, but
because child welfare ultimately,
you know, yes, child welfare. Obviously, it's a child, right? We get that, but to rule it out, let's just bear in mind that sexual offences is a very broad and elastic definition for what may or may not have occurred. And so I'm very wary of having a kind of absolute no, you will never see your children. I mean, parental rights are quite important, by the way. I mean, you can't just have the state going around cancelling them. You know, so I do. And I mean, because I kind of, you know, I've been, as you say, working with the issue of IPPs, you know, there have been instances where IPP prisoners have been denied the right to have their kids visit them in prison, even though they're on indeterminate. I mean, these are, to me, barbaric state sanctions, and I'd be very, very wary of going down that road. The other thing is that I was just thinking about Jen saying about performative. This point about people on the sex offenders register not being able to change their name, I support that, by the way. In fact, I'd go further, because I don't want them to be able to change their gender or sex categorization for the purposes of going on the sex offenders register, which is what I argued. Of course, I was called a transphobic monster for my trouble. But I do agree with that. But the sex offenders register, as you know, as it happens, that bill was already agreed as part of the Victims of Prisoners Bill. And it's like reappears the same thing. And they brought it in as a way of highlighting the fact. And I think it genuinely was, oh, well, we got it through, but now we're going to really make it the law. And I do think that that's my nervousness again about legislation being used, as Jen described it, in a performative way for political purposes, rather than, when it comes to criminal justice, this having serious implications for people's liberty, justice, freedom, how society's operated. And I get nervous about that.
Time is against us, so let's keep moving on this one. The Associate Prosecutor's proposal, which sounds like a bit of a kind of a technical thing, but it effectively means that individuals who don't actually necessarily have to have legal training could be fronting up prosecutions in court. I mean, they already do that to a degree. I think this is about expanding it further. I mean, Jen, I mean, I suppose my concern here is that it could, if anything, it could potentially lead to more failed prosecutions, because you'd have individuals who maybe don't have the skills or knowledge or experience. No disrespect, I mean, very good in other ways, but law is a very technical area, and you know it's important to get it right. So, do you have concerns about this proposal?
I mean, I think in terms of the text that we've got, it says could be used in appropriate cases, and like all the situations we have where you've got appropriate as the qualifier, I think it's doing a lot of heavy lifting here. So I think we will see a very circumscribed set of circumstances where the associate prosecutor would be used. But I mean, it's not like they're not used in this way already, and this is very clearly a step that's being proposed to mitigate delays and backlogs in the criminal justice system. But we already see associate prosecutors operating in the context of contested cases, and there have been extensions of that reasonably recently in terms of suitably trained, and again, that's quite a useful qualifier coming from the CPS itself, suitably trained associate prosecutors undertaking specifically contested hearings, so ones that include perhaps non-imprisonable summary offences. So I think that appropriate cases is really doing a huge amount of work here. But I think the whole impetus should really be taken as one dimension to tackle the criminal justice system backlog, and this will only be effective if it goes hand in hand with other changes, and those other changes would be, you know, hard infrastructural changes like the courtrooms or crumbling courtrooms, but at the same time, things like, you mentioned legal aid earlier on, but available judges, licensed legal aid solicitors, suitable counsel, and so on and so forth. So I think it's perhaps a step in the right direction in terms of attacking and attenuating this backlog. It's one step.
I mean, can I just come in quickly and say I've got a few concerns about this. I mean, one of the things I'd like to see the new government have a real good look at is this single justice procedure, which has given rise to a lot of, you know, injustices, I think. I mean, it's at the bottom end of the seriousness of offences, sure, but there's been some terrible cases reported, particularly Tristan Kirk, the court reporter in The Standard, has done a fantastic job in bringing this to the attention. So now we're saying, okay, we don't actually need proper prosecutors to be taking cases. Are they going to be people who are going to, you know, be confident enough to discontinue cases where it's not in the public interest to prosecute and all that? So I've seriously got some reservations. And just on the victims' point, I know most of the measures here are dealing with top-end, very serious stuff. I don't think there's any mention of restorative justice in any of the stuff that's come out. It's not appropriate in every case, but it should arguably be available or considered in cases where victims and offenders want to give it a go. It's always been stuck at the margins of criminal justice, and I think this would have been an opportunity to try and strengthen the availability of RJ.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah,
let's move on.
Can I come in briefly?
Yes, go on then, Rory. Yes, please, Rory. Yeah.
It just seems there's like so many different directions in the King's Speech with these new associate prosecutors or their expanded remit. We seem to have somewhat of an attempt to tackle the backlog. With the change to shoplifting, it looked like we've got an attempt to add to the backlog. And so many of the proposals just seem tokenistic, banning ninja swords, respect orders. Like there may be reasonable technical legal reasons for reforms, but they're headline grabbing. And it's just such a shame that there wasn't any sort of step back to see what are the key problems in criminal justice and what's the slow, serious response to them. One thing we lost under the Conservatives was this Royal Commission we were going to have, which was going to take that step back and say, what does criminal justice need? I think a braver point from Labour would have been to say, this is a big problem. We need time, we need expertise, and we need funding. And we don't need headline grabbing policies. We've got a big majority. We're going to set up a 3-year Royal Commission. So I think that's something we perhaps missed.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's move on to the planning and infrastructure bill. But before we do so, we have another poll which but we want to put out there for everyone to look at, which is basically a bit of a kind of a temperature check on it. You know, at the start of Labour's 3rd week in government. So how do we think they've done so far? It's very early days, obviously, but be interested to see the audience's thoughts on that. So we'll put that poll up now. There we go. And we'll come back to the results shortly. But let's just go on to the planning and infrastructure bill, which is really about, well, as the King's Speech said, get Britain building, including more planning reform as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing. And this bill is going to be one of the ways, certainly, that Labour achieves its more general growth agenda, assuming it does that. But it's also in relation to prisons, it would be the way that Labour would seek to unlock what they currently appear to feel, and they're not alone in that, it's a cross-party view amongst the number of MPs, sort of a rather too restrictive planning regime, which makes it difficult to to get built sort of nationally significant infrastructure projects, including prisons. Now, we can argue about whether prisons are the right priority. The former Justice Secretary Alex Chalk said recently that after he stopped being the Justice Secretary, I hasten to add that we're going to have to think carefully about spending £600,000 per place on new prisons when we also need to be thinking about building hospitals. So there are going to be some big political questions and judgments to be made. But thinking specifically within the justice system itself, I mean, given the current state of the prison estate, a backlog of maybe £1 billion plus in repairs, would it not be better to be spending money on ensuring that the existing estate is brought up to scratch rather than having endless arguments about building new prisons? I don't know if any of the panel would like to kind of pick up that particular loaded grenade and play around with it for a bit.
Well, I mean, I'd agree with you absolutely. I mean, I did some rough calculations. This reducing to 40% the amount of people serve in prison would still mean that people will serve longer on average than they would have back in 2010. Why? Because sentences have gone up. There's been this massive sentencing inflation for most kinds of offences. Why we've had that? I mean, maybe offences are more serious. Maybe people are more criminal. I think, but I doubt that that's the whole explanation. I think we have just got harsher through the efforts of parliamentarians, through the actions of the judiciary, the sentencing council, which produces guidelines. Whatever one might think about it, as an institution, in my opinion, it has failed because it has failed to enable the supply of prison places to meet the demand for prison places. In a sense, that was how it was conceived. It was conceived in another prison crisis back in 2006-7. So yes, of course, there needs to be a way, I think, to try to take down the temperature, to reduce the length of most prison sentences, and therefore reduce demand for prison places. And so I would say not necessarily even build all of the 20,000 that are currently on the cards. Maybe use some of that money for alternative infrastructure, whether it's psychiatric hospital beds, whether it is approved premises, bail hostels, a range of what used to be called in the juvenile arena intermediate treatment, not just prisons, but a range of other options that can be used for people in conflict with the law. And some of the money could, yes, be used to improve the appalling conditions that prevail in particularly the older prisons, but even some of the ones built in the 70s and 80s. You read these inspection and Board of Visitors reports, they're shocking, but we've become inured to the shock of it, I think. And so I think there's a real opportunity with this big majority, as others have said in other respects, to take a step back and say, look, we really need to do something about this whole sector and be sensible, try and take the politics out of it, and produce a public service that, if we won't necessarily be proud of it, but we won't be ashamed.
Rory, just picking up on Rob's point there about the reduction of the sentencing or the automatic release point from 50 to 40% of sentence. I mean, one of the things it strikes me about all of this is that we go through these sort of situations where successive parliaments and governments will increase sentence lengths and it will be embedded in legislation. And then ministers are kind of basically forced into these administrative measures to effectively reduce sentence length, or at least the prison portion of sentence length, to deal with the, the crisis of capacity, which, periodically we get. So I'm just wondering what you think about that as a proposition, but also about this weird situation where, we have this commitment to build more and more prison places, which never actually quite get delivered on the timescale needed, whilst we're also kind of driving up prison population in other ways.
Okay, a bit to unpack there, but let's start with the difference between ever-increasing maximum and reducing the release points in practice. I think you can look at that and say, isn't it ironic? But I think it's much worse than that. I think there's a fueling of public expectations that are then not being met. Stalking is a serious criminal offence. Let's increase the sentencing maximum. We're also going to release early release for some prisoners. But if what we say is 10 years imprisonment is going to become 4 years imprisonment instead of 5, I can understand public disappointment because the language isn't reflecting what's being done in practice. So I think we're stuck in a horrible cycle. And I think the easy reach political response is a higher maximum for this new offence, a new civil or hybrid order for this offence. But these are sticking plasters. So do we need more places in prisons? Do we need new building of prisons? Yeah, maybe if we accept the premise that this is what criminal justice is going to be going forward, but we don't have to accept that premise. We could have serious critical review with a look at improving community sentences and other disposals, and in fact, take one step further, keeping people out of the criminal justice process in the first place. So no, we don't need more prison places. We need to take critical time to think on what we want our criminal justice system to be.
But I agree, but that's not happening. In which case we need more prisons. I mean, it's not because I want to concede the point, but I just don't want to end up in a situation whereby because I think the situation will be worse if they kind of just keep reducing the sentences and let people out for the reasons you've explained so well, Rory. It creates public cynicism. So I'd agree with you about a new sentencing bill, which they didn't put in, by the way, in the King's Speech. I'd agree at looking at it all, take a step back. Yeah, but this is a government we're talking about. It's shown no indication of doing that, apart from appointing James Timpson, who, is one man and he hasn't got much power in truth. So I think they do need to build new prisons, but they're already in a situation where they are going to have to face down a lot of NIMBYism in building new houses. Never mind new prisons up the road, and we have yet no way of knowing if they've got the courage to face that down. But the only other thing I wanted to say was that, excuse me, while the prison estate is a disgrace, a lot of the reason why it's so miserable being inside is not just the physical thing. It's the fact that there isn't education, that there isn't, it rots the brain apart from rots the body. And it's those kind of rehabilitation schemes, things that will stimulate and get people thinking. I mean, education and all the rest of it, that would make a huge difference as well. And I would like to hear a lot more of that. But I do want new prisons being built, but then that not being the only thing they do.
The point you make, our discussion before the general election on the manifestos, and one of the panelists, Ian Aitchison, commenting on the malaise in prisons, was saying if you're unable to empty the bins in these places, what else is going wrong? And I think that kind of sense is not, I mean, it is obviously about the infrastructure, but it is also about staffing. It is to do with the general regimes, the stuff that you were just talking about, Claire. We're very quickly running out of time, and I think what we should do is share the second poll, the scorecard for Labour. So if we could put that up, there we go. How do you rate the government's first few weeks? Well, there we go. 46% promising first step. Maybe the appointment of people like James Timpson is partly behind that. But then 25% saying nothing to get excited about. So kind of a bit of a spread of views there. Again, not a scientific survey as we say in these situations, but an interesting temperature check. Okay, before we finish, we're right up against it now, but we just want to kind of very quickly reflect on what's not in the bill, what's not in the King's Speech rather. What are the kind of priorities which the government doesn't seem to be focusing on yet, or at least not in terms of what's in the King's Speech? So perhaps each of our panelists, there's one or two very quick thoughts you have about what you would be liking to see the government prioritising, which maybe at the moment seems to be slipping down the agenda. Jen, would you like to go first on this one?
I was quite surprised that there wasn't anything overt about joint enterprise. So considering that Kim Johnson was so vocal about this in the early part of this year even, it was a little surprising that this wasn't picked up, considering really a lot of the legwork had been done in terms of setting the scene and setting the tone. The other one, the obvious one, is probably legal aid. Just a big gap where it would have been nice to see something, particularly in terms of Starmer's DPP background, to see something that nodded in the right direction of the necessity of legal aid and the absolute paucity of provision that we have right now. So those would be the big two for me.
Thank you very much, Ed. And we have a Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. We have a new report coming out this Wednesday on joint enterprise and what needs to be done. So we'll let everyone who's attended this event know about that when it's out. Who wants to go next? Rob, would you like to share your topics?
Well, just very quickly, the Labour manifesto promised 2 reviews would be undertaken, one on sentencing, and as Claire said, there's no real mention of that or any sort of sentencing legislation. I mean, that's risky because they may want to push sentences up, but hopefully they won't. The other one, which I think has taken on more importance since perhaps they wrote it in the manifesto, is this question of the governance of probation, which sounds incredibly dry and tedious, but actually, headline of one of the papers today is about 97% of probation services are failing. I mean, I think that's a bit OTT, but there are some serious questions about whether probation is in the right place in government as a sort of next to prisons in the civil service, whether it could be locally managed, whether it has enough resources, whether the people it's expected to supervise are the right set of people, whether there could be better links with the youth justice services, which generally are doing quite well. So I think that, particularly because there are going to be more people coming out of prison into probation, is a higher priority than perhaps, people are saying probation has been through a lot. The last thing they want is yet more change. I disagree. I think they've got to crack on and do it.
Thank you very much, Rob. Rory, what would be on your top of your list of things to prioritise?
Yeah, perhaps a smaller one, still very big. Resentencing of those on IPP sentences. I think there's some excellent work by the Centre amongst others. The Justice Select Committee seem to be getting behind this, that there is a good case for resentencing those who have been in prison for a substantial length of time or have come out and gone back in repeatedly due to being sentenced under this egregious type of sentence, imprisonment for public protection. Some move towards fuller and longer term response to that crisis would have been appreciated.
Thank you. And yeah, there's a private members bill in the House of Lords under Tony Woodley's name, pushing the resentencing issue again. I think it's due for its first reading in September. So let's see what happens there. And finally, Claire, what would you any thoughts of things you'd like to see?
I completely agree with them on joint enterprise and on IPPs, but I think that the disappointing thing is the lack of joined up government. I hate that phrase, but I'm using it now. What I mean is we have a justice minister, as Secretary of State says, yes, we, because of the prison crisis, have to release people before the 40% rather than 50%. Whereas there are people that are way beyond the tariff of a sentence that was abolished over 10 years ago with IPP. And then it's like, oh no, we've got to remember public protection. And I think that public protection, that emphasis on public protection, which is an insult to the public, by the way, because it's not about protecting the public, but it's the way of nodding to the public, is something I'm disappointed in. And joined up thinking because they've got a mental health bill coming through, which is great, potentially. But, there's huge swathes of mental health issues that are related to people in prison who shouldn't be there. And also IPP prisoners are becoming mentally ill because they're IPP prisoners and they can't get the justice. My final thing is, I'm sorry, but they're introducing too many laws that will criminalise behaviour that should be beyond the scope of the criminal justice system. My pet hate is the conversion therapy bill, but you don't have to go with that. There's lots of it, and the antisocial respect orders will be part of that. Sometimes law and the criminal justice does not solve a problem. You need moral leadership. You need a different kind of intervention. But they're creating more laws, which means that they're going to criminalise more people, which means that more people are going to end up in prison. And they won't even, and, we know what that means.
Thank you very much, Claire and Rob and Jen and Rory. We're about 5 minutes over our planned end time. I hope those who've stayed, which is the vast majority of the participants, agree it was worth that extra 5 or 6 minutes. So thank you for everybody who's attended this event today, and thank you for the panelists for making it such a enjoyable and brisk and breezy conversation. That's our last event, certainly for this, before the summer break proper, but we will certainly be back in the autumn, and we're going to be very keen to track what the new government is going to be getting up to on crime and justice. So stay in touch through our bulletins, and thank you again, and look forward to seeing you at a future event.